Hello, and welcome to today's MER Sapient webinar titled Hindsight 2020, ECM Implementation, Formula for Success. My name is Lynn Williams with the MER Conference. Please hold on, we'll begin this webinar in just a moment. Good afternoon to all of you joining us from the eastern half of the country, and good morning to those of you joining us from the west. Welcome to today's MER Sapient webinar titled Hindsight 2020, ECM Implementation, Formula for Success. This webinar is brought to us by Access Sciences. My name is Lynn Williams, and I'm the Speaker Concierge with the MER Conference. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you today. Next slide. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few bits of housekeeping. During today's webinar, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the GoToWebinar control panel. Press the question button and type in your question anytime during the webinar. Today's speaker will address your questions at the end. After the webinar, I invite you to take a short survey. This survey helps us to serve you better in future webinars. I'd also like to remind you that today's webinar is being recorded. A link will be sent to you via email so that you can access this webinar at a later date or share it with a friend and colleague who may not have been able to join today. Also, everyone attending will receive an email with a certificate of attendance. Next slide. We'd like to thank our 2020 Sapient sponsor, Nixia, for making this year's webinars possible. Next slide. Now I'd like to introduce Ashley Schilling, Technology Manager at Access Sciences. Ashley, I turn it over to you now to start the webinar.
Thank you, Lynn. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Schilling, and I'm a managing consultant with Access Sciences. I've been with the organization for a little over 10 years now, and I've been involved with projects ranging from data analysis to system implementations. I personally was involved with a lot of successful implementations early in my career, and I was wondering if that was just luck, since it said that 70% of all IT projects fail. But as I've progressed through the last 10 years, I've gathered a lot of lessons learned from my projects and from projects where Access Sciences was brought in to right the ship. I hope to relay some of those lessons learned with you today and show you how important planning appropriately is to success and how it can help you avoid the paths to failure. At Access Sciences, we wanted to share our lessons learned and our best practices from our experiences helping companies to improve their information management programs. The formula for success breaks down the most critical components of an ECM implementation to ensure a consistent, well-designed strategy. The webinar today is part 3 of a 4-part series that details steps to evolve an information management program to its desired future state. If you saw parts 1 and 2, great, but if you happen to miss them, that's okay too, as they are up on the MER Sapient website. But let's do a short recap to see what got us here. We started with an assessment of what's currently in place to get a clear understanding of how the technology impacts business needs and processes. We analyzed all of that information, we evaluated the needs, and we identified the pain points that an organizational-wide system could help us fill. We then went out to procure that system by engaging our stakeholders to ensure that we have active participation from the right people throughout the organization during our requirements gathering. We used these to define our approach. We then constructed our demo scripts to level the playing field during the vendor demos. After we completed our objective evaluations, we selected our system. Once you've procured the Enterprise Content Management System, or ECM, the implementation can begin. For many organizations, This is the step that can be the most overwhelming and the most inconsistent, especially when the implementation team is rushed to try to meet tight deadlines. Without an effective strategy, appropriate resources, and prioritized onboarding, your investment can be underutilized. But what's the right way to accomplish these things? How do we ensure that it's a successful implementation? That's what I hope to be able to relay to you today. Finally, step 4 is managing that change. After a system is implemented, users need to understand how to use that system successfully. But change management is more than just training them on an existing system. It's the communications and the engagements throughout that entire process. Each one of these steps is necessary to having a successful information management program. I'll just be covering the implementation part today, but if you can, I do encourage you to go watch Assess and Procure on the MERSapient website and be sure to mark your calendars for the upcoming change management webinar. What we're going to look at today is a two-part formula that, based on our lessons learned, helps to ensure a successful rollout of our ECM system. As we go through each piece of this formula, we're going to look at why it's needed, how we do it, and what the outputs are. But remember, this is not a sprint, it's a journey. Just like a baby has to learn to crawl before they can walk, and walk before they can run, a good implementation could take us months to many years, and like the tortoise and the hare, nothing good ever comes from rushing it. So this is our two-part implementation formula that we're going to go through for each phase of our implementation. A good implementation is so important because it can overcome almost any software issue. We'll explore not only the aspects required for configuring our new system, but what's required to set up an effective program around enterprise content management. Many of you may be familiar with the plan, do, check, act model. It's used as an improvement process based upon the scientific method of problem solving. We start with plan, where we understand the problems and we define the solutions. Then do, where we start putting those plans in place and making them real. Followed by check, where we monitor and analyze how well the plans worked. We start running our metrics and reviewing them, and then we look at our audit results. And finally, we act. And act is where we make adjustments based on what the data is showing us and how well we are achieving our goals, which is what we set out to do. We review this with our steering committee and we create our plan. Then we change our implementation plan for the next phase, and then we reinforce the things that are working well. Then we'd start back at plan for our next phase and do this for each of our pilot, phase 1, phase 2, etc. And in the middle here, we see the Access Sciences 7-point governance model. We're going to use this model to go through each of our 7 variables. The beginning items are heavy in the planning, the next few in the doing, and the last one in check. And then act encompasses all of our variables depending on where our adjustments need to be made. Today, we're going to discuss what to think about or act on within each one of these variables. And we're going to use this model to ensure that we don't miss anything. But before we jump into the planning, we're going to do a quick poll. So let's take a moment to think about what major issues you've experienced in your ECM deployments. Is no one using it? Maybe you don't know what departments you should start with, or have you just encountered a lot of problems along the way? Or maybe you're just getting started with your implementations. So I'll give you a few seconds to respond to this poll.
Okay, Ashley, it looks like our results are in. It's pretty evenly distributed. Yeah, so it looks like 33% say we are just getting started, followed by 28% saying we encountered a lot of problems, 25% saying no one uses it, and 14% We don't know which departments to start with.
Well, great. For those of you that have encountered a lot of problems, the good news is that you're learning what not to do. This is the valuable part of our 4-step cycle, the ACT, so we can take those lessons learned and apply them so that we don't make the same mistakes twice. And I'm glad to see that there's a good number of you here that are just getting started. So hopefully this webinar is helpful for you today and you can find some new items that you hadn't considered yet. So we'll get started with our first variable, which is strategy and scope. So this is where we identify the business objectives from an enterprise level and the scope of the initiative with regards to the people, the processes, the content, and the systems that will be impacted as the platform is rolled out across our organization. But what happens if we don't have a strategy or scope? Well, this forces us to be reactionary, and being reactionary is always slower, so you miss things. Ultimately, we end up spending time and resources to address issues that are not related to our goal. If we haven't identified which systems or storage locations are in scope for the first phase, we'll end up down a number of rabbit holes with no real direction or end in sight to get our first business units onto the system. It may seem like we're going to spend a lot of time in the planning cycle, and this is true. We can't just jump headfirst into configuring our system. We need to remember that the system is only a piece of our implementation. The program that we're going to set up matters. The foundational components are critical pieces of our implementation plan. We have our IT strategy and information landscape, the enterprise taxonomy, what's our common language and our shared classifications, our metadata model, which is enabling our robust search and findability, our lifecycle management or retention and disposition. We have a policy, we have a big bucket records retention schedule, and we have to understand how this will map to the content types within our system. And then we have a security model with a security policy, and we have to identify the roles and security levels and then map those roles and levels. So as we're starting to plan for our strategy and scope, we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we're trying to do? What business problems are we looking to solve? What are the drivers? Maybe we're looking for better integration across our systems. We're looking to standardize forms across our enterprise, or maybe process improvements, or even reducing paper and going more electronic. Do we have common understanding across our leadership of why this is being done and what the vision is for our future? After we answer these questions, it's time to set the scope and create a high-level roadmap. It's important to have a roadmap to understand where we're going. For instance, here's the roadmap for my trip to Hawaii. I had food, hiking adventures, beaches, and just everything that we didn't want to miss laid out around the Big Island. This allowed us to plan our routes for each day so that we didn't have to backtrack and lose precious vacation time just driving the same roads for some areas we may have missed. It's the same with your implementation. A high-level roadmap ensures that capability improvements are prioritized and sequenced to maximize efficiency in delivering our business value, while still minimizing the disruptions to the ongoing operations for our end users while we bring them along with us on our journey to our desired future state. Projects on the roadmap will address delivery of the right tools, the right processes, and the right behaviors to effect sustained and transformative change. When creating the roadmap, we want a phased approach. Depending on the size of your organization and the complexity of your solution, this could be over months or even years. But how do we know when things should happen along this journey? Well, when we think about how to prioritize our business groups, who will be the champions? Have we identified early adopters? What was the driver for the funding to begin this initiative? Maybe we have audit findings that we need to address. Or maybe there's groups that are using third-party cloud systems that IT is looking to get a handle on. Or maybe we have records management needs. When we look at functionality planning, we want to base this upon our organizational needs. Just because a functionality is available in the system doesn't mean we need to use it right away. Standards and processes must be in place for each new item before they're released or we're going to experience all of the negatives from having a lack of governance. What functionality do you have in-house expertise to support right now? What's a realistic rollout strategy and timeline for the new functionality? Does a group you're planning to roll on in the next, say, 6 months have a strong case for one of the new modules? We want to take all of this into consideration while we're planning. The roadmap we make tells us where to start, which groups to start with, and what functionality we're going to be implementing during this phase. Now we construct our implementation plan as seen here. So to do this, we dive into the roadmap for the departments and we set our timeline and we build out our detailed implementation plan. This is essentially the start to the project plan. We have ordered tasks with responsible parties, participants, the purpose of the task, and the estimated durations. All of the activities are included in this implementation plan, from kickoff, design, build, testing, go live, and training, and ultimately sustainability. This is a reusable plan across our departments, and it's going to feed directly into each of our project plans during our phased rollout. Our second variable is governance groups. This identifies and establishes our authorities to govern and approve processes, capabilities, and infrastructure to enable our information to be a useful asset and reduce liability based upon our organization's business requirements. But why is governance important? Well, without governance, we see site sprawl. I'm sure a lot of your organizations have seen this today with SharePoint or Teams or even on your network drives. You get a lack of consistency or no organization because your users don't have any guidelines and boundaries, so they just do what they want. There's no enterprise search because there's no information architecture in place with consistent metadata tagging. It becomes a security nightmare because there's no real way to know who has access to what from an enterprise view. So it's just ultimately not sustainable, and you end up with a lot of frustrated end users. Different teams throughout your organization represent unique views and areas of expertise. So for this reason, we recommend establishing a cross-functional strategic team with representation from core groups, including the business, IT, and records and information management. With a strategic team, the higher the level your representation is in your organization, the better. From the business side, we often see a high risk of failure if they're not engaged because business requirements need to be identified, defined, and then supported. It's critical to understand how the business operations will be impacted for successful user adoption. The true business value of your new system cannot be achieved without including the business. And oftentimes, the resulting program is difficult for the business to use. So we want to remember essential governance. When RIM is not part of our strategic team, considerations for risk and compliance often go unaddressed. And without IT, we don't have visibility into the IT or security strategies, what existing systems we have, and what integrations could be possible. This often leads us to point solutions and even redundant systems. So again, we must include everyone in order to be successful. A three-tiered governance model is recommended for the ECM platform as shown here. We need to identify the groups and individual roles that will play a critical part in determining how the platform will be defined, deployed, used, and then modified over time. Governance is frequently not thought about ahead of time, and this often causes issues down the road as rules or processes need to be updated or changed in order to account for those new responsibilities. What assigned roles and responsibilities do you need in order to maintain what it is that you're developing? A steering committee is typically made up of the executives across the organization, ensuring representation from each of our three core groups. They're responsible for the strategy and updates to the governance model. The services team consists of the implementation team and IT support. It handles the configuration standards and ensures compliance with our policies and our regulations. Finally, you have a department owner community. This is comprised of the owner for each departmental area who's responsible for their department's use of the system. Managing the ECM environment requires a mixture of responsibilities in the short term, being the day-to-day, and the long term, being the strategy and the vision. The tiered model enables clear separation of roles and responsibilities between our strategic actions, being our direction and our purpose, and our tactical actions, being our execution and our know-how, as well as delegation of the decision authority from our enterprise down to the business as appropriate. Governing an enterprise application so that decisions are made at the right level in the organization to be able to enable sufficient analysis of the impact of these changes without introducing any undue bottlenecks into the decision-making process requires us to use a federated governance model. This enables the decisions to be distributed to various levels in the organization based upon the impact of the decision. Decisions may be made by the business to the extent possible, and then only decisions that are driving standards, reliability, and security are escalated up to the enterprise level. Now we need to dive into each of these groups and define the specific roles and responsibilities for each. Once we understand what each role is responsible for throughout the system, we'll be able to define our training, our security, and our permissions that are required to fulfill those roles. If we think about a particular department, we don't want all of the end users contacting support on a day-to-day basis just to understand where their information goes, or to add a new user to a particular area within their space. By giving these responsibilities to a department admin who has had sufficient training to become a power user in their department, we're able to alleviate a lot of this additional strain on the IT support desk. We can't have our policies without the procedures to implement them. Policies and rules are the why. They must be established to direct appropriate use so as to deliver on our business objectives while remaining compliant with our regulatory requirements. And then our processes and procedures are the how. They're the supporting processes and procedures necessary to govern the changes to our design, our configuration, operation and use, and enforcement of our policies. The first step in outlining our policies and rules for the ECM system is to create our guiding principles. The principles come from our goals and objectives for the system. These principles will guide the development of appropriate policies, rules, and standards to govern our ECM platform and ensure that our goals are met. In defining these principles, we want to ensure that we're reviewing existing policies across our organization and identifying the gaps that we have for any additional policies that we may need to create. So some example principles would be establishing a system of record, or improving findability and availability, or maintaining content according to governmental and business requirements. To support these guiding principles, some example policies would be things like the IT policies around disaster recovery plans, or security policies for document confidentiality. Our information management policies around classifications and holds management, and our records retention schedule, which tells us how long our information needs to be retained and any approvals that are required for its disposition. When we look at enterprise taxonomy design, this is part of our information architecture that we're laying as part of the groundwork for implementation. Once we establish these policies and identify any gaps that we may have, we need to write them and then follow our approval process through our governance groups to put them into place. But how do we know what goes into these policies? Well, let's take a look at an important policy that's affecting our information architecture, the enterprise taxonomy and facet design. We can see an example of what this could look like and what kind of approvals would be required based upon its impact. But to get to this point, we first have to understand how many stakeholders will be impacted by this change. If it's just one area with a new term, or if everyone in the organization is impacted by, say, a new facet or metadata column being introduced. We also need to identify the level of effort to make this change real in the system and what roles are able to make that update. But don't stop with the policy. Effective guidance through processes and procedures is important. We see this a lot. Organizations will develop a policy for records management or information management with statements on retention or disposition, but the level of governance stops there. There's not a documented process for how to dispose of records and information, or the processes only cover paper. This is risky because people need specific guidance on how to comply with policy through documented processes and procedures. As an example, would they know what effective, timely, secure disposal of electronic information looks like on their own? Processes, procedures, and training are necessary to guide people's actions and support their ability to comply. It's the implementation aspect of the policy that's frequently left on the table. Processes and procedures show the workflow of approvals and decisions required to enforce our defined policies. For instance, if we continue looking at the policy for the enterprise taxonomy and facet design, the process may look something like this. We can see all of the roles within the organization that are involved in the process in each of these horizontal swim lanes. Another process for end users is to understand what their content is and where it should be stored. So a what goes where type of chart, as shown here, will help them in making these types of decisions on what system is appropriate for their content, since not all content repositories may be in scope for our new system. Not only do we need these type of defined processes and procedures from a system-wide perspective, but we need work group specific too. This is often a gap for organizations, as functional groups don't have the information management elements embedded in their procedures, like classification and storage. So by defining what each storage location is for, this will help them in making these determinations. What is this and where do we keep it? How do we know how to make that type of decision? Using content maps like this one will help us take this a step further for each group and help them understand what the classifications and the retention is for each type of information that they work with. I helped the client create this type of mapping for a business unit, and then the client attempted to follow the same process for the next one. However, they did not fully grasp the importance of guiding the business unit through this mapping exercise. Instead, they gave them a template to fill out. The business did not understand the importance of classifying their content using our enterprise taxonomy elements, nor did they know how to correctly assign retention to their information. The mapping that they produced for this business unit did not fit into our implementation plan for the system, nor did it contain any of the information architecture pieces that we put into place. Had we moved forward with this, the robust search, classifications, and even retention would not have been successful. It's important to work with the business and educate them along the way. There are a lot of processes and procedures that need to be fleshed out. But to get your mind thinking in this direction, I've called out a couple here that I've seen a lot of organizations miss, like new site provisioning. How does the request come in? Who reviews it to see if this type of content already has a home that exists? Records destruction. Depending on how we'll be implementing our records retention policy, are there any manual steps that are the responsibility of the end user? Are there any company-wide workflows that we're going to automate? Perhaps one that approves content for our website? Is this going to alter the current way that these items are submitted by our end users throughout the organization? And permission changes. If someone's leaving the group or a new team member joins, what process do we follow? So at this point, we've covered the first half of our formula, the planning phase. We've created our strategy and scope. We've established our governance groups and defined the why and the how with our policies and their supporting procedures. So now let's take a look at the tools and the systems. This is where we identify the design and the configuration necessary for the platform and any supporting technology tools to support compliance with our established rules and then verify proper configuration through testing. I can't stress enough how important it is to define the requirements before you start configuring and deploying your system. I'm often responsible for developing testing scripts, but I was recently engaged with a company that had developed their testing scripts based off of what the system was supposed to do, not what the business wanted the system to do. So what happened? Well, they got through their typical testing cycles, unit testing, system integration testing, those. And then when we got to the user acceptance testing, the business couldn't use the system. Everyone was confused because initially our testing had went fine. But the real problem is that they were essentially doing software testing of the product and not the way that it was configured for the business. So how do we make sure that we avoid this? If you've attended our other two webinars on assessing and procuring, you may have noticed that we talked about requirements gathering in all of them. Requirements gathering is extensive, and you want to ensure that you're doing the right amount in each level of your project. So here, we're going to be pulling back even more layers of our onion and getting even more detailed. But based on the requirements gathering you did for your procurement process, you have an organizational-wide view and understanding of the high-level system-wide functionality. These documented business requirements need to be translated into the form of use cases. These use cases is what should drive testing and training. The test cases should be written off of these use cases by role. For instance, in this example, we can see that the records management administrator needs to be able to export content that's on hold. So during our testing cycles, we need to test not only the role-based security of the records management administrator, but also the configuration that has been done within the system to allow the content to be put on hold and then exported. These use cases also directly impact our training. By understanding what each role is doing in the system, we know what areas that they need to be trained on. We not only need these enterprise-wide use cases, but we also now need to go deeper and conduct our in-depth requirements gathering with the business units for this phase. From this, we need to understand our work group specific views of information. We can use things like file plans or content catalogs that marry the policies with the content and the information architecture elements. If we think back to our strategy and scope pieces, we've now turned these into actionable processes and procedures and detailed use cases by role that fit the business needs. These documents give us the information that we need in order to configure the system to support compliance with our policies. So now we must determine how best to configure each of these things to alleviate any undue burdens on our end users. When designing configurations to support our information landscape, if we look at our sample procedure for provisioning new working areas, is this a centrally managed process? What pieces of this process does our ECM allow us to automate? Can it be managed manually at first and then scripted, maybe using PowerShell, before too many new areas are rolled onto our system? Or do we see the number of these requests being too large to manually handle, even up front? These are some items that we should consider prior to rollout so that we don't end up with frustrated end users that don't even have a place in our new system for their content. Our enterprise taxonomy will be configured differently depending on our chosen system. So for instance, with OpenText Content Server, we would use categories and attributes. And with SharePoint, we would use content types and columns. And some of the other systems we work with, like FileNet, Laserfish, or Highland, they have their own ways of referring to it. But regardless of the system, we know that our taxonomy values are centrally managed, and they provide us with a standardized list to the entire organization that enables us to have a true enterprise search experience. As we begin to expand our metadata model for each of our groups, This opens up opportunities to standardize our naming conventions and hopefully allows us to automate the document names, depending on what features or modules we may have available. Lifecycle management encompasses the content from creation to archival or destruction. There are several paths that the configuration can take in regards to retention. At what point in the document's lifecycle does it become an immutable record? Are there automated triggers that can be implemented in the system to ensure that the documents are retained according to their record series? Will records be sent to a central record center, or will they be maintained in place until their destruction? I know this security model example may seem overwhelming, but it should be reflective of the roles that we've defined. What system privileges does each role require in order to fulfill their responsibilities? What is the level in which each role gets that privilege? So if we take department admins, for example, if we look at their assigned responsibilities from our governance model, we'll see that they can create folders. These folders require the folder administrator permission level to be able to create, update, or delete. But we don't want a department admin to create folders anywhere in our enterprise, just within their own area. What about external access? Are we allowing users that are not part of our domain access to certain areas of our system? Are we segregating this information out, or is it going to be commingled within our different departments? That leads us to variable 6, which is training and engagement. This is where we identify the training needs for all identified roles that will be impacted by the ECM platform and the required degrees of competency for each of those critical roles. With insufficient training or engagement, we get user frustration. People don't know how to use their system, and instead of asking, they find ways to stick with their old systems and processes. They don't embrace the change because they don't know how the new system can benefit them, or even how to use it. There's no real incentive for them to adapt to the new ways of working. In many implementations, the client has us manage all parts of the implementation. However, in some, like the one I'm about to share with you, we're only engaged in pieces. It allows us to see how other organizations approach their projects, and it also allows us to identify some mistakes. In a recent client engagement, we provided migration and information management support to an implementation team. Communications about the new system were very limited and only given to a small group of core team members. Additionally, the training was provided to users very late in the implementation process, and it was very high level and focused mostly on system functionality. There was no change management effort focused on how the new tool would fit into their existing business processes. So as a result, in the days following go live, only a handful of users logged in to use the new system. Analysis showed us that the users were continuing to use alternate storage locations. If you do not have adequate stakeholder engagement and meaningful training, users will not see the value in making an effort to work in a new place. The old saying, if you build it, they will come, does not apply to a new ECM system. People need to feel supported with their new ways of working. Remember that this is an ongoing change. To construct a training plan like we see here, with the role on the left and the topic on the right, we need to look back at each of our roles and the responsibilities that we've assigned them. From this, we can create an outline of each of the items to be covered by role. The end user training will always be a prerequisite to all of our other roles. And as we can see in this example, the end user guide contains the basic document management functions like viewing, editing, loading new documents, and versioning. Then we have the department admin role, who can do a few additional items like running some reports for their department or updating some of their metadata options. And then we have the records management administrator, who's responsible for the enterprise-wide records management tasks, like applying and releasing holds. So once training content has been developed for each of the roles, it should be delivered to the pilot group, as this gives you a chance to test it out. And ideally, this training would happen before UAT or user acceptance testing occurs. If that's not possible, then your UAT test scripts need to be verbose enough for any untrained users to follow step by step. You don't want users testing your system that don't understand how to work with it. The remaining users who are not participating in UAT should receive their training prior to day one or go live. Ideally, this would be a day or two before, so that when users first log in after their content has been successfully migrated to this new system, they can continue working instead of not knowing how to edit or upload a document. Training is an essential part of onboarding users to their new ECM system, but it's just as important to communicate with them throughout the entire process. Users should have been engaged initially during the assessment and the procurement of this system, so by now they should be aware that something is coming. It's important to engage them early and often with communications throughout the entire implementation. The communication plan and strategy should be embedded within our implementation plan. So now that we've reviewed our first 6 variables of the governance model through the plan and do cycles, we're going to do another poll. Which of these governance model variables have presented the biggest challenges in your implementations? Did it have to do with the strategy and scope? Was it around the governance or the policies and their associated procedures? Was it with the tools and systems or in your training and engagement?
Okay, Ashley, it looks like the results are in. The variables that have presented the biggest challenges are training and engagement by 40% is the result. Next in line would be policies and procedures at 27%, governance at 20%, and then we're tied at 7% with tools and systems and strategy and scope.
Well, this isn't surprising that we're seeing such a trend here with training and engagement, because a lot of organizations end up cutting the budget on change management. They don't realize its importance until they're seeing a low user adoption. So now that brings us to our last variable, audit metrics. This is where we identify essential metrics that should be monitored to evaluate how successful the ECM platform is in meeting its established business objectives, and how effective governance is in supporting us to meet that goal. Without audit and metrics, we have no gauge of success. So how will we know that we were successful? What pieces of our plan were correct and what pieces do we need to fix? Now we want to check and audit to make sure that the processes are being followed and determine what needs to be reinforced with training or even additional system controls. It's important to collect feedback because surveys help us to understand user adoption and satisfaction. We're looking to measure where we are and enforce accountability. If we think back to what does success look like, we can determine what it is that we need to monitor to measure for that success. Could be things like how many people have logged in? What's our daily active user count? How many new files were loaded last week? Are we getting any new folders being created? What % of our information is being tagged correctly with our enterprise metadata? These things will help us understand the effectiveness of our training and engagement initiatives and aid us in determining how well our configurations are enforcing our defined policies and procedures. This will highlight areas that we need to address during our ACT cycle. But we need to ensure that the metrics we're going to collect are meaningful so that we don't end up with too much information and we can't make sense of any of it. Once we establish what those metrics are that we're going to collect, we need to build the tools or enable the appropriate logging and reporting for each of those statistics or metrics. This example here shows some reporting that's available through Office 365, but other systems have similar reports available as well, or we can build our own using any raw data that we have. And that brings us full circle through the 7 variables of the governance model. Based upon what our metrics are showing, we now act and make the appropriate adjustments throughout or add additional system controls to prevent any unwanted behaviors, and then we reinforce the behaviors that are working well. During implementation projects that we've been involved with, we found that utilizing this formula has helped to mitigate a lot of the issues we've seen in other projects. The most time is spent in the planning cycle with defining the strategy and scope, setting up governance groups, and defining the policies and the processes to realize our guiding principles. Having a plan forces you to be proactive instead of reactionary, which always leaves you one step behind. But configuring these in the system to prevent any unwanted outcomes is just as important. Through prioritized onboarding to our new system and effective training and engagement, we should begin to see our version of success, while having the measures in place to identify where we're falling short and identify what we can do to ensure that our next phase is even more successful than the last. I hope the pieces to this formula have given you some new ideas to consider as you're planning for your implementations. And if you're interested in finding out some more information about these types of projects, be sure to check out our website at accesssciences.com/case-studies. There's a lot of good case studies out there to read. And I want to thank you guys for joining me today, and I do encourage you to sign up for the last webinar in this series on change management versus creature of habit, which Frederick Hall will be presenting next week on May 21st. You can always reach us at accesssciences.com, or you're welcome to email me directly as well. And with that, Lynn, I'm going to pass it back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ashley, and thank you so much for today's webinar. I'd like to invite our audience to stay with us for just a minute while we go through the upcoming webinars, because Ashley will be back to address your questions, and there are several questions that have come in. So Access Sciences will be back with us on Thursday, May 21, with part 4 in this series, the Hindsight 2020 series. So please join us for that. And then Conturo will be with us on June 2nd with responding to access requests under privacy laws. So we invite you to come to that as well. And we'll be announcing more webinars in the coming weeks. So please refer to our website, mersapient.com, for the most up-to-date listing. Next slide. So I do want to thank you all for attending today's webinar, and I will turn it back to Ashley now to address your questions. So Ashley, it's all yours.
Thank you. So we do have a few that came in here. So I see one says, how do you distribute the new processes and procedures? Well, this is going to come into play with your training and your engagement. So as you're rolling out these new processes and procedures, you want to make sure that you're communicating them from the top down, the highest level of management down through users' direct supervisors. And then once that awareness is there is where your training sessions are going to come into play, and they always want to make sure that you're training on these new procedures. Regarding the test cases you mentioned, does every requirement need to be a test case? Well, that's going to depend. We do need to look at each of our requirements and evaluate them individually. Does the system allow us to accommodate that requirement? And if it does, is it something that we're going to be implementing during this phase? And if we are, then yes, we would need to write a test case and a use case for it. How do we select a pilot group? Is it based on complexity of the department, size, or some other variable? Well, you want to ensure that your pilot group will be a champion for you of this system. So you want to choose a group that's both eager to use it and whose business processes are going to allow you to have a home run. You don't want to choose a group that has a lot of complex interactions with other departments, as this is going to end up adding a lot of complexity to your pilot. These complex groups need to come a little later in your implementation once you've made it through your cycle a couple of times and updated it. If an entire company is rolling out a new system, is the training that one department might get, is that specific to them? Or does every employee just receive a general training regardless of the department? Well, for the most part, your end user training is going to be generic for everyone, but there are going to be items that are specific to each department, and that should follow along with our departmental content maps of what their content is and where they're going to store it. And they may also have some additional items like workflows that would only be relevant to them. I think that's... Oh, you mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that implementations can last years. What causes that large time frame? Well, that's going to depend on what size your company is. You know, it can differ significantly from company to company. If you're a small organization of about 100 people versus 10,000 users, you know, you could see some differences there. It's also going to depend on the configuration time for the system that you chose. You're going to need to take into account how organized your different departments' content is today. So I didn't have a lot of time to touch on migration throughout today's webinar, but in my past experiences, migration is often one of the items that takes the longest. Typically, you'll see groups that may think their content is really organized, but for the most part, it's not true at all. All right, I think I got all of the questions.
Excellent. Well, Ashley, thank you so much for answering all those questions at the end as well. And we really want to thank Access Sciences for today's webinar. And thank you all for attending today. We do hope to see you again at the next MER Sapient webinar. So I wish everybody a great remainder of the day.